Hi there, welcome to the Family Health Lab. I'm Claire McDonald-Liu. I'm about to talk to internationally renowned nutrition researcher Belinda Fettke.
You're listening to the Family Health Lab. Healthy parents, healthy kids.
Hello, hi Belinda. Huge thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Hi, Claire. It's really fun. I wish we could catch up in person, but this will do.
I'm hoping we will do in either Western Australia or one of the events, maybe in Tasmania. So yeah,
Yes,
that would be really lovely. I've been enjoying our chats, but it's nice to meet in person as well.
it is.
So you're a mum and you're a former nurse and you're also a well-known, internationally well-known nutrition researcher. And you live in beautiful Tasmania. I'm imagining green rolling hills around you.
Absolutely. We chose to live here for so many reasons, but I think it's incredible. We've got a hydroelectricity, so it's a natural resource here. We've got incredible pasture raised livestock, got fresh, seasonal, local fruit, veggies, and all sorts of things that really support our way of being, our health, I guess. And to us, it was really important to make those changes.
I knew that you lived in a really, really pretty area and you had some sustainable aspects of your land. But I didn't realize it was to that level. That sounds really interesting. So does that form a bit of a hobby for you, a bit of a side interest that when you're not at the laptop delving into the research for tens of hours at a time? So do you kind of get some on the land and kind of get stuck in?
We don't have a lot of land. We have sheep, we have chickens, we have free range eggs. They're amazing. There's nothing like a free range egg. We have quite a few veggies. And when I say fruits, limes, lemons, and occasionally lots of tomatoes in season. So yeah, it's great. And I think it's been incredible for our children to be able to just go out and see where things are coming from, to understand all about nature. A lot of our friends own bigger farms. And so the process of where animals come from and the life cycle, I think is just really fascinating. We had a quick chat just before, and I told you about an upcoming podcast I'm doing. But I think what I took away from one of the episodes that I've listened to is the concept of the circle of life. I think it's really important for us as mums and for we in society to think about this concept of ancestral cultures had this birth, death, and rebirth. It was very much natural. They might grieve the people who passed, but there was it was part of what they did. And certainly our First Nations peoples, their symbiotic connection to country and to each other and to the foods that they sourced. We've sort of forgotten that in Western society. And this girl I was listening to called Kate Kavanagh, she was talking about the fact that Newton, and I can't remember the other guys' names, I'll have to have a little look, but they changed time from being the circle to linear. And so if you think about our concept of life and death I guess this is all the way back to how we access our food supply as well. As a linear, you fall off the end. There's nothing there. It's an abyss. And so we've come to fear death and fear taking an animal's life. I guess, it just makes so much sense when you think, where's that circle of life? We need to get back to that. And as mums, this is what we nurture within our families. We want to keep them healthy and those resources that we need to be able to produce healthy offspring, to have successful pregnancies, to raise children. It relies on the natural resources that we can access. And as we mentioned, how lucky are we in Tasmania to have those things here? But I think in Western Australia, you would have a lot too.
Absolutely. We're in a really we feel very, very lucky with where we are near Margaret River and we're able to kind of get involved in the farming, the farmers markets and really get to know where our food is sourced and meet the people who are producing it and support their work, and go to meetings and learn about more about biodiversity and what they're doing. We're in a really, really gorgeous area. We were in the UK as well when we were living over there. So we were in a rural community in Leicestershire, and we were again kind of meeting in with the organic and the biodynamic farm producers, and getting to know our food delivery and our
Yes.
veggie boxes, our meat box is really important. And it is kind of, for us as well, food education for our children. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with you and talk with other people in the field to share this information for families and my own children to keep them interested and engaged and learning because there's so many alternative information coming at them from all angles. So really, I feel getting them connected and me staying connected with people who were not overcomplicating food and nutrition and kind of going down a particular type of ethos around counting something or adhering to something, but just getting back into almost traditional foods. I find that a really important point. And then I just say as well, I found it fascinating you were talking about death as part of life, and I don't hear people, many people commenting on that at all. And I do think that kind of respect for life, and respect for
Yes.
animals, and
Yes.
respect for the meat that we're eating, the animal product is hugely important. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I think it's really, really important and something that we're definitely moving more and more towards. And if I'm honest, I can say that back in the 1900 in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, you know, it wasn't a priority in our lives. You get so busy, caught up with so many things. As you say, I was a nurse in my past life in the 1980s, back in the day when you used to have to wear a nurse's cap. And I remember one day, my very first bed bath, I went in and the curtain flipped my cap. I'd been a nurse for all of 8 weeks, and it landed in this tray of water I was carrying. I was humiliated. I thought, oh my gosh, I felt like I had to run back to the nurse's room and get a new cap. And oh my gosh, I was so embarrassed. I just thought, oh, just ruined everything. So, but this is back in the day when the pink ladies, which is what we call in Australia, certainly in New South Wales and in Tasmania, where I've been, they bring around magazines and foods for patients and things. They were selling cigarettes to people in their beds when I was nursing
Wow,
back in the
really?
day. And so it was interesting how cigarettes have been found to
Mhm.
be harmful, especially to people in hospitals who are trying to recover. Gary, my husband, is an orthopedic surgeon. He actually told people he would refuse to operate on them for 6 weeks before their surgery. That's elective surgery, because he understood the complications of that cigarette smoking was affecting their arteries and their blood vessels. It would narrow them. And that's what sugar does too. It took a long time to work that out. So he worked out the cigarette smoking back in the 80s. And then,
Mm.
but what we eat, we just got caught up, followed the food guidelines, the dietary guidelines, based our meals on starchy carbohydrates, minimized fat, all sorts of things. Certainly ate discretionary foods. But I think we just didn't even think about it. But subliminally, because of our role in health profession, we definitely followed the dietary guidelines. And Gary was very much aware of it. He told me, because I loved butter. He'd say, don't eat butter, don't eat butter. Oh my gosh,
Mm.
you just get it.
Yeah,
Something terrible is going to happen. And I said, oh, I really don't like margarine.
yeah.
Didn't eat cereals. When we first met, I'd never really been much of a cereal person all my life growing up. And as I was nursing, having to start at 7 o'clock in the morning, I go, oh, I can't eat breakfast this early. So I'd often wait. Just my natural habitat was to not eat until 11:30 when I had the break. So it was quite interesting. Whereas Gary just was really programmed to have cereal, no matter, even if he started work at 6 in the morning, he would, have sugary. He really loved crunchy nut cornflakes. So he was having sugary breakfast cereals and toast and sometimes eggs and things, but really basing it on carbs. 2 hours later, he was starving again. And they provide morning teas in the hospital. So cakes, biscuits, all of those things were there. Lunchtime, he was starving again. Is it any wonder that, by the time, or in the year 2000, when he was diagnosed with his pituitary cancer, any wonder that he was overweight, pre-diabetic, had high blood pressure, suffering from gastrointestinal reflux? All of these things were just piling up. And because they're so insidious, it comes so quietly and creeps up on you. You don't really notice, and you certainly don't think about it as being related to the diet that you're eating.
No, particularly when you're doing a lot of the right things and you're seeing other people who aren't eating as healthy, and you're having home cooked meals, and you're switching over
Yes.
to those healthy fats, and you're cutting off, you're probably having lean meat, and all of the other messaging was probably the main part of your diet. But this brings us neatly into how you got into your area of nutrition research work, which isn't how your everyday academic gets into.
No.
So not at all. The
Not
absolute
at all.
opposite. And your story, if you don't mind sharing your background with yourself and Gary, who you mentioned is an orthopedic surgeon. I mean, it is incredible, absolutely incredible what can happen to a family who are trying to do the right thing, and a professional who's trying to do the right thing by his patients.
Well, I think it mirrors your story. It mirrors a lot of people's stories in this low carb community. People have found it through their own health journey or the journey of a loved one. You know, your kids, Gary, it was just, we stumbled upon it, and then understanding how that could improve health outcomes for other people. And then why was it being silenced? So yes, that's a quick summary. Now I'd like to go back. Gary started looking into diet. He turned to Dr. Google in 2011. He'd had major surgery in 2000. He'd had radiotherapy and been on 11 and a half years of chemotherapy on and off for a very aggressive pituitary tumor that they couldn't remove. So it wasn't affecting his ability to work. But he did feel sick from this chemo. And in 2011, when they said, we just don't know what we can do, he went doing his own research and came across some work by a guy called Colin Champ and another one, Dominic D'Agostino, in America. And just seeing that the work they were doing, looking at the role of sugar and cancer. Now, if you think about it, you have a PET scan, which is, I don't know the exact word, it's electromagnetic sort of scan, but they inject glucose into the bloodstream, and that glucose travels along, and wherever your cancer is, it lights up to the degree of hyperactivity of those cancer cells. So Gary's lit up like a Christmas tree, flaming red. You know, I think it's got all levels of cool going right through. He didn't think about it at the time. The glucose was highlighting where the cancer cells were active. Not a thought about it. Not a single person at the hospital at the time said to him, you need to think about your sugar, you need to think about your diet, and any of those things. No, nothing was said. And in fact, Gary developed a complication of his surgery and tumor, which was called diabetes insipidus, which is quite different to type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes, where you're having trouble with your insulin and regulating that and the absorption of sugar. With diabetes insipidus, you can't actually concentrate your urine. So he was peeing a lot and told at the time he had to drink a lot. And when I say a lot, 9 to 11 litres of fluid a day. And the hospital said to him, water's going to get really boring. So we suggest you have fruit juice. I also wonder, Claire, if maybe cancer drives a real need for sugar because that's
Mhm.
what it thrives on, certainly
Yeah.
Gary's cancer. And so he was honestly starting to look more and more for sugary things. Didn't help that he's having sugar, the fruit
Mhm.
juices and things. I wonder, that's just my hypothesis, just as a wife looking at his
Mm.
response to food during that time. And so in 2011, he came across this work. He also came across a book called Sweet Poison by David Gillespie, which some people may know, some people may not, but I highly recommend you look it up. He is an Australian lawyer or an ex-lawyer. He got fed up with, uh, s- he would see as perceived conflict of interest, sponsoring food industry and different things. And I think he was involved with the cigarette industry at the time. So he saw a very similar pattern as I have come across with the cigarette industry and the sugar industry, and how they use their marketing and their bullying tactics, and they're paying for research and all sorts of things like that. So was given this book, and he said, could a lawyer know about sugar that I don't as a doctor? But if you go back to medical education, they're trained to do biology, physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, all of those things in the first 2 or 3 years. They really focus in on those things. And then they are so busy being taught how to band-aid sick care how to operate, medicate, do surgery, but actually it's just almost drilled out of them to remember back to that time. And all their exams are about, well, what happens if you have this drug and what happens if you do this? And it just becomes a very siloed view of medicine. And so you don't actually need to learn nutrition per se to understand the basics of the biochemistry in relation to the foods that we eat. Nutrition science doesn't actually have to involve hundreds of hours of nutrition understanding. It can, and it's amazing, but the basics are all there in their education. They just lose sight of it.
How much training does he recall having on nutrition during his medical training?
Specifically, he reckons it could have been under 10 hours. Again,
Yeah.
very small.
I have heard that.
And he would say it's never about sugar. It's never about insulin. It's never about the importance thing. Certainly not about the importance of cholesterol in our bodies. Zoe Harcum's work's just amazing when you read her thing. And I think this is where Gary, when he started to reduce sugar from his own diet, well, as soon as he realized it was beating his cancer, he went cold turkey, never eating sugar again. That's it. It took a few months for him to remember that starchy carbs actually become glucose the minute that you eat them.
Mhm.
He said, oh my gosh, I've been so brainwashed in medicine. I didn't even remember something that I learned in high school. You eat a sour biscuit and it's glucose. So it's been a journey and began as a journey for himself in eating healthier. As you go lower carb, then he started to think about the importance of animal fats and proteins in our diet, which again had been totally shut off in his medical education. We learnt to fear saturated fat back in the 1970s, and that's a long and complicated story, and I'm happy to go there. But it got into medical education in the 70s. And by the time Gary was doing medicine, it was just common sense that cholesterol's bad, common
Mhm.
sense that saturated fat's bad. Like, it didn't even have to justify it. So it's an interesting how we just start to just accept the messaging that the media, that I would say vested interests, are trying to put out.
It's strong. It's very,
It
very,
is.
very persuasive, and we're seeing it again and again. And hopefully, we'll come to that. And what we're, what we're seeing and how we've been influenced. But in terms of Gary, he changed to he cut sugar first of all, and he, for lower inflammation, for not feeding the cancer, which is becoming now. I mean, this was over 10 years ago when he started his journey.
2011.
And it was not widely accepted or known, and now there's been really good case studies, some good research on ketogenic diet and starving cancer cells, particularly with the efficacy with brain cancer. I would say that's kind of where it's coming out as strongest with the cancer field. But he was a trailblazer in your both of your journeys in work with quite at the early stages of people becoming really interested in sugar, but also that the bread is a sugar, which is something I think a lot of us are learning and coming to. But that point you make that we'd forgotten as a whole society, we'd just got the blink
Yes,
on, collective amnesia that we'd forgotten that
absolutely.
that starch is a type of sugar to the body, and the blood sugar reacts same. So when those people were trying to lose weight over a long period of time, they weren't understanding that those highly processed foods that were savory and they didn't taste sweet were affecting them as a sugar might. But yeah, so how did it affect Gary's health, his own journey? And I know it's a complicated one, but did he see improvements with his low sugar?
Massive, massive. He lost a lot of weight. His blood pressure returned to normal. He got rid of his pre-diabetes, massive improvements in his own health. And he was able to come off under supervision. He was able to come off all chemotherapy. So even though they still couldn't get rid of the cancer and he still has cancer and he still needs to be aware of his cancer, they have said that the chemotherapy doesn't work as well in controlling his cancer as his diet does. When they've looked
Mhm.
to do a trial, it just doesn't have as much efficacy. So and also it's fantastic for somebody who has a cancer to feel like they're doing something as well. It's so
Mhm.
much better and much more motivating to think you're actually doing something to help rather than being a patient and sitting back
Mm.
and just, I don't know, it's a very different mindset. And seeing all of these changes in himself, I didn't give up sugar quite as quickly. I got rid of the sugary foods and everything else, but I was having I kept cutting down in my tea a bit more, a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. And it took about a year, but I was happy. And I think that's also important that I didn't see in myself with all the other things I was giving up. I didn't see that it was as urgent. And I was able to comfortably come off sugar. I couldn't even imagine having it in my tea now, but it took me a little while. And I think that's okay too. I don't think everybody has to do cold turkey like Gary. Um, but if you have type 2 diabetes or you have cancer and you have something that you are determined to do it, or if you find it hard to cut down and not get back on the bandwagon, you might find it easy to go cold turkey. So, there's lots of different ways. We had a business called Nutrition for Life for a while. And we also said to people, you know, every time you give up, it gets easier.
Mhm.
So some people might be able to give up and never go back. Other people might give up and then they feel like they've failed, but they haven't, because the next time they try, it is easier. And then the next time they try, it's easier. And the next time, yeah.
But coming from a different starting point, and I think we've got
Yes.
so much around the language of failure, or you're not achieving, and looking at somebody else achieving it much, much quicker.
Yes.
And I do know people who just the penny has dropped, or they have got a chronic health condition. And in the case of our daughter with a ketogenic diet, it's all pretty quick gone. But then, the vast majority of people who aren't managing a chronic condition, it's a really good point, Belinda. They can come at this at their own level. I was working with a family recently, and they felt completely overwhelmed by what they felt they needed to do as a family in order to help their child with autism. And instead of giving them everything all at once, and if they haven't done that, they're failing. We took it back to the biggest wins and the biggest
Yeah.
influences, and sometimes that can be enough, and that's enough, certainly enough for them to target right now. And that's going to have the biggest impact. Whereas if you said do absolutely everything all at once and change everything in one go in every element of your life, you're setting yourself up for failure. And it's a journey. Food should still be enjoyed as well.
Exactly. That's a really, really good point, Claire. And what we tended to do with people at Nutrition for Life, a lot of people, was just extend a bit of fasting to start with. Easier. Yeah. Okay. At 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock, when you finished your meal, clean your teeth. You
Yes.
won't feel like going back and having something more to eat. And then extend a little bit longer the next morning as you go along. And that was something that was a lot more achievable, we found, with people, sometimes in changing complete diets. And breakfast was also an easy one. Oh, you can have eggs and you can have different things. Gary, leftover dinner and all different things that make that meal really, really simple to change. So the longer fasting and a different breakfast are the
Yeah.
two things that we went, oh, great. You're right on track here. This is a really good move forward.
Yes, manageable.
Going back to Gary's story. So as an orthopedic surgeon, he firstly, as I say, it was his own journey. And then he started to look at his patients. So 20 years ago, he might have seen someone once or twice a year with the complications of type 1 and type 2 diabetes that required some sort of debridement or amputation of their foot, their toes, their foot, or even their lower leg, once or twice a year. By 2015, he was seeing someone in his clinic at the hospital every single week in northern Tasmania.
My
This
goodness.
is a catchment area of about 120,000 people. This was a tsunami. He just said, it's just come out of nowhere. I can't tell you, Belinda. It is frightening. I didn't go into medicine to maim people. I didn't go in, it sounds bizarre, but if there's a really bad car accident, he's like an engineer. He can put people back together, and it gave him such a joy to improve people's health outcomes. But when he was looking after people with type 2 diabetes, that was potentially a result of their lifestyle, he just felt like he was maiming them even more. And it was becoming very disheartening. When he worked out maybe reducing sugar could help them too, it'll improve their blood glucose. And that's all he was talking about at the beginning, just reducing sugar. And that's what he was reported to the medical board for by a dietitian at his hospital. So his patient was being fed the typical hospital menu, and the diabetic menu includes 3 desserts per day.
Wow, 3. Goodness.
3. You can have
Mm.
ice cream at lunch, afternoon tea, and dinner or supper or something. This was a diet endorsed by the hospital, endorsed by public health, that was causing people to have such extreme fluctuations in their insulin production. Their blood glucose was out of control. It often meant that then people would have to go have more insulin while they're in there. Gary said, this is not helping my patient heal. They need a lower carb diet, but we need to reduce sugar to start with. And then we need healthy fats. We need healthy protein and healthy fats to heal the body. So he couldn't understand why the medical board decided to continue this investigation, because dietetics isn't even under the upper medical registration board. So it's medical, it's chiropractic, it's dentist, physio, all sorts of things, but dietetics isn't under that umbrella. So he thought, why are they investigating me talking about reducing sugar, talking about not eating ultra processed foods? And he was stepping on toes he didn't even know were there. So yes, that gets to my story. I was a nurse in my past life, but I'd actually been a professional photographer for 20 years. Gotten out of medicine completely. But I was watching Gary just improve his health. I was watching his excitement in changing his patients and seeing improvements in their health. My daughter and I said, oh, you've got to get onto Facebook. Tell more people about this amazing thing you're working out. So that was probably how he became a target. But anyway, he got onto Facebook. Gary Fettke, no fructose. He was very excited and he started talking about the science of sugar. The biochemistry of fructose was only worked out in 2010.
A hot topic, but I hadn't realised it was that
Yeah,
that
2010.
new.
So Gary was presenting information that the medical board weren't even up to. They hadn't even gone there yet. And so over the 2.5 years of this Star Chamber investigation, which was very, very similar, people may have heard of Prof. Tim Noakes over in South Africa. It was a very similar timing, but his was a very public trial about talking about introducing low carb to children when they finish breastfeeding. Gary's was all Star Chamber. We had no right to legal advice. No appeal in a court of law. Like, it was just bizarre. And so Gary just kept researching more and more. So whereas he knew quite a lot at the beginning, at the end of the 2.5 years, he knew so much. One of the guys up at Sydney University said he was his most avid student he'd ever had in understanding the biochemistry of fructose in particular, and certainly the body's reaction to sugar and how insulin is affected and cholesterol and all of those things he looked into massively. And so he felt he was well qualified to be able to talk about these things to his patients. But the medical board determined in 2016 that he would be silenced. And this silencing was non-appellable, was lifelong, and he risked his medical license if he spoke about it to his patients or to the public. And they made this massively petty statement at the end, Claire. They said, even if LCHF, because by then it was low carb healthy fats, even if LCH becomes accepted best practice, you can never talk about it. And that possibly be protecting the public.
And this was behind closed doors, as you said,
Yep.
so non-appealable. And in a nutshell, he is allowed to practice. He's allowed to cut bits off, cut toes off, irritate people
Absolutely.
for the results and the consequences of a high sugar diet. As we know, it's really clearly linked there. But he's not allowed to advise for them to make any dietary changes that might help them to maintain their eyesight or have less harm happen to them. But he is allowed to. I understand. I think that he's allowed to tell them not to smoke or to exercise, but he can't tell them to or hint at them to manage their blood sugar levels, because a lot of them were not aware or that they could take those actions for their own health. That's so crazy and so sad that that was the situation that people are in generally, the population, and that Gary found himself. I mean, the pressure on you as a family must have been immense.
It was huge. He had his researched projects taken away from him. He had his he used to lecture to medical students. His academic position was taken away. He was bullied and mobbed. He became a target of the Dietitians Association of Australia. The CEO at the time in 2013 and 2014, wrote to his hospital twice to demand he be silenced. And Gary said to me, he went to speak to the dietetics department and he was so excited. Look at this. Look what I'm finding out about sugar. Look what I'm finding out about fructose. And I couldn't understand whether maybe they didn't want Gary to be the first one to talk about it, or they just really couldn't see what was right in front of them. So then I stepped in. I said to Gary, Low Carb Down Under, Rod Taylor, Jamie Hayes, they'd started this amazing thing. Gary was one of the early people on the speaking tour with them. I said to Gary, you guys are all speaking about the science. It makes a lot of sense. I've got a nursing background. I understand what you're coming from. Nobody's listening, darling. They're not listening. And I said, I think I'm going to have a little look at who the expert witness is who was brought in to determine if an orthopaedic surgeon could talk about sugar. And you've got to understand, we're in a small community here, so we don't have the resources. In a big hospital in Sydney or Melbourne, probably an orthopaedic surgeon wouldn't be the person who was recommending that because it would be done by a different specialist. But in Tasmania, Gary was the foot surgeon. He was the person who was looking after people with type 2 diabetes complications. And do you know, the scary thing is, Claire, that Gary has been out of the public hospital system since 2018 and nobody has taken over.
Right. So it's still not happening. People are
So
still not having
people
that
are
support.
just getting, they're just having band-aided care now. They're just
Mhm.
having amputations, dressings. There's nobody come into that space to really support at all. And it's very disturbing.
It's
But
disturbing, and it takes brave people like yourself. I mean, this is another reason that I wanted to talk with you and to do this podcast, because it's taking a brave few to speak out. And you have sometimes the tagline of "Be noisy" and "Be noisy with me." You're part of a small group within Australia and the wider world who actually want to help the community and bring these
yes,
issues to attention. So you then at this point you started to it's around research,
so
who's
look,
who,
yeah,
delve,
who's who?
and then massively deep dive.
I must have had cognitive dissonance. I was determined that this man must work for sugar industry. But it turns out he worked for the cereal industry. And I uncovered documents in 2017, 2018 from a group of cereal industries, Kellogg's, Sanitarium, Nestle, and Freedom Foods, used to meet once a month. And they were trying to work out why their cereal sales were down. And in one of the documents that I uncovered, and I'm not a hacker, I'm not clever, I'm not technologically minded like Justin. So these were leaked documents that were on the internet. And these documents stated that Low Carb Down Under was target, and Gary was named specifically as the only medical doctor targeted for active defence. And these cereal group, it was called the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturing Forum, trading as cereal for brekkie. They were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 a year to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal grains and sugars messaging. Now, we spoke to dietitians and they had no idea their parent body, the Dietitians Association of Australia, which is now called Dietitians Australia. I think they didn't like that I could fit so many of their sponsors across 3 letters. They've pulled it down to 2. This is a parent body who not only regulates and accredits, but it educates dietitians. And this is really, really concerning for us, for the general public, to understand that even dietitians don't understand how manipulated they've been over the last, I'd say, since the 1970s, 1980s, when the Dietitians Association of Australia was first formed, how manipulated they've been by the food industry. And that messaging is then coming to us. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Cereal. All of these subliminal messaging that's just come through, basing our diet on starchy carbohydrates, minimizing fat in our diet, reducing protein. I think I've said to you that saturated fat was demonized in the 70s. Well, I believe animal proteins are being demonized now too. And this doesn't just become dietetic education, it becomes medical education. Our doctors fear saturated fat. Gary asks a lot of people, what is cholesterol? They cannot answer it. They cannot answer what cholesterol is, something so vital to our body that we make it. My dad developed Parkinson's and Alzheimer's at the end of his life, and his brain had been starved of healthy fats for
Mhm.
decades. First of all, the doctor said to Mum, "You got to get rid of eggs. You got to get rid of saturated fat. Can't eat all of these things." So she switched his diet to be margarine and seed oils and all of these things. And then they said, "Oh, no, it's still too high." He wasn't sick. This was just picked up in a routine blood checking, routine health check. And they put him onto statins. And so, combination of the statins and his low fat diet, all of those years, I just watched him deteriorate. And I just thought, this, didn't realize at the time, but now that I understand what that was doing to his body and especially to his brain, makes you realize how important healthy fats are for our kids' brain. They're developing. Why are we being told to fear something that was so integral to an ancestral diet?
Absolutely, a traditional, healthy, whole food diet, or whatever,
Yes.
however you want to term it. We've been taught to fear eggs and fear meats now, and
Mm.
we're normal on absolute daily basis, normal within the school system, within the shops, our food environment. We're getting out of a packet, and we have the health washing labeling, which tells families that this is actually good for them. And it's actually optimum. This is the best thing that they could be giving their children,
Yes. I
which
know.
is
It's confusing messaging, isn't it? It's just
it's completely confusing. But that boiling it back down to the incidence of health, what if Gary had have been told earlier in his career about his own health, and bringing that back to the nursing community that you were a part of, and the
mm,
medical community. They're one of they're a very unhealthy workforce. Long shifts, access to poor quality food during shift, weight problems and chronic disease within that workforce arise. And then boiling it back down to us as individuals, it's the grandfathers that don't spend as much time with their children, the grandchildren. It comes back down to that level that it impacting us. We're not just talking about a philosophy or a history lesson and the history of research and nutrition and practice. This is actually making an impact, I would say, on every family across Australia and that world. This is how much time you'll get with your mum. This is how well your
yes.
children will be. This is how well they'll perform in their class. Would you have liked to have known when your children were young and you were bringing your family up? What would you like families to know now? There's so much, really.
I would have liked to have known that the dietary guidelines were shaped by vested interests. I think, you know, no idea. As a nurse, Gary's a doctor, we just believed it. And I think understanding, I always enjoyed history at school, but I wished I'd done anthropology and like a lot more history into a lot of different areas. They direct you in a certain way, but there's so much history that's incredible. I think I wish I'd known because our children didn't have quite the illnesses or the complications of food that your children developed, and you could pinpoint. I would say our kids, it's slowly festered.
Mhm.
Again, Gary will tell you he was a fat kid when he was growing up. No, he wasn't obese, but he was overweight. His mum actually tried to put him on diets all the time, but they ate a lot of processed food. They ate all the low fat stuff. They ate seed oils. At least my mum had been a dentist, a dental nurse, and we didn't have a lot of money. And so she invested in some good quality protein meats, real meat. She cooked. She spent that time. I think it 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 complicates things. And he believes he is one of the first generations that really felt the ramifications of a highly processed food menu growing up. And he believes a lot of his health issues came and stemmed from that. But then he also believed it. And so he put it on our family. And, that low fat, high carb foods, I mean, they were integral in our life. And so I guess we've apologized to our kids. Luckily, they're improving their health, but it's a journey to even turn around 20 and 30-year-olds lives from, potentially eating like we had fresh meat, we had based on rice and pasta and bread. Gosh, and Wheat Bix. My son, he would have 13 Wheat Bix for breakfast because he
13.
just 13. He wanted to just absolutely explode. And even though Wheat Bix doesn't have sugar in it, it turns to sugar when you eat. But it's so bland.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much sugar we put on it to make it
That's
edible.
exactly it. Nobody actually eats that stuff without putting, well, I can't say nobody, but it,
Honey,
from my
sugar.
understanding, most people put chopped banana or a form of sugar honey or some sweetener or sugar on them because they're so bland tasting. But 13, that's got to be some sort of record.
And then he come home after school and have another 10. And I would just be thinking, this is awesome because
The
it's
fiber.
not very much. You're so hungry. This is a cheap food. It's
Yeah.
healthy.
Yes.
Wheat Bix is, honestly, I was brainwashed. Wheat Bix is healthy. I celebrated the fact he ate over 20 Wheat Bix a day. I thought, this is so good for him.
Yeah.
And he's got peripheral neuropathy in his feet. He's in his early 30s.
Yeah.
I can't say it's Wheat Bix, but I would say low fat, high carb diet and a lot of Wheat Bix potentially contributed to it. So I think, there's a lot we need to unpackage as mums, and you can't sit there with a lot of guilt because you think, I did the best I could at the time. This was what I had been educated to believe was
Mhm.
healthy. And certainly, as you mentioned before, Claire, you walk into a supermarket and there's just marketing jumping out at you. High fiber, high this is good. 5 stars, do this, do that, do that. It's overwhelming. And if we can get back to supporting local farmers markets, if we can spend more time on the outside of the supermarket, which is what we would do now if we can't get to a market or we need something as an urgent thing. But I think trying to support farmers and understanding more of an ancestral diet, Gary says we don't need dietary guidelines at all. We might need them for people who are sick, but they forget about that.
They're
People
not
with type 2
included.
diabetes, they say follow the dietary guidelines, which makes no sense whatsoever.
They're for
But
only the healthy population, but they're not intended for people with diabetes, for
No.
their lifestyle-related ill health. But
Yes.
then that's where they get their education. That's where they're given the information from to follow the dietary guidelines.
Exactly.
And just back to that circle of vested interest that you dived very, very deeply into in your phenomenal source of information. I heard your talk at Laconda in 2019, and it was a wow moment for the conference. The detail you packed in and the information, and it was so clear how well versed and how informed you had gotten since this happened with Gary, and what happened to your family. You went into protector mode, and you've obviously really dived in, but put that research in, and now putting it out there in the world and teaming up with others and joining podcasts like this one and other ones and various different projects that you were telling me you've got on the go, which sounds great. But you were really boiling that down to what's happened in our history, how we've got to this point, the vested interest of moral philosophies, religious groups, corporate interest. And then interestingly, on the nutrition guidelines, that sounds like a flat document that isn't very important to families and they're not very switched on about it. What impact does the nutrition guidelines have on an everyday family? How does it affect their life, or does it affect people's lives?
It absolutely affects your lives, even though you might not realize it. Children, education, so especially into high school, they are taught the dietary guidelines. Home economics is based on the dietary guidelines, whereas in history, when home economics was first started, it was about the economics of the home. It was about the money and how they could look at all those things. So I don't know about you, but certainly when my kids have done home economics, it's gingerbread houses and it's this biscuits and it's that cake and it's
Pineapple cake, yeah, all of that.
Oh,
Yeah,
not
shortbread.
anything to do with economics. It's
Mm-mm.
it's purely, and they get away with it because they're not allowed to talk about low carbohydrate. We've got a girlfriend who's a teacher in home economics in the school, and she said she just wants to get rid of all the sugar that they have to keep consuming and making and creating, but she's not allowed to do it because it doesn't follow the dietary guidelines. It's like, my gosh. So yeah, it affects the school. It affects childcare facilities because that's what they feed children based on the dietary guidelines. It affects people in hospital. But if you look at those food hospital menus, they are the worst of the Australian dietary guidelines in essence. And as I say, 3 desserts per day. And it just encourages people when you're sitting in a hospital bed and you're feeling really bad. Gary was fighting in his hospital to just get tiny little cheese packets, to get Greek yogurt put
Mhm.
on the menu, just so people could have some healthy fat and
Mhm.
not just eat all the poor quality foods they were pouring out. So, I just should just say he was completely exonerated in 2018 after 4.5 years, but we had to go to the National Ombudsman to fight the process. And eventually it went to another state, and the other state went, "Well, what is this even about?" and threw it out, and he had a formal apology. But yes, in that 4.5 years, there was a lot to deal with our family and with Gary and his work, and beyond that, even I guess how other doctors reacted to Gary and their fear that they might get into trouble if they were starting to talk about what he was talking about. So the fact that he was exonerated really has given a lot of protection to a lot of doctors now to feel more confident to be able to talk about nutrition, because they couldn't go down that road again. I I started a whole website to put the middle finger up to the medical book and to fight what they were trying to silence. So I think for mums now, it's trying to look at things to improve the health of your kids. And unfortunately, that's not ultra processed food and not necessarily cereal for brekkie. It's about looking. I mean, even back in the day, we thought fruit juice was healthy. There's so much sugar in fruit juice. It's once you put it through that mixer and you separate it from the piece of fruit, it becomes a processed food. And literally, it's just sugar, and your insulin just will spike. Your body will react to that. And I I think I've tried, well, certainly with our team at Nutrition for Life, we owned a dietetic business for a while. When Gary was silenced, he decided, well, he couldn't talk about it. He found some amazing dietitians who were very on board with the concept, and a educator. So, diabetes educator. And so this team worked, which I think it's important to become like a community, the support, accountability, and motivation. I don't know if you found it when you first started going out, but when we went out, people would cajole us. Oh, you don't need to give up sugar. Oh, have a piece of cake. It's not going to hurt you. And honestly, it was worse if you told people you were giving up alcohol because you're an alcoholic. They'd be supporting you. They wouldn't offer you another drink. But when you give up sugar, it's very confronting to everybody else.
Yeah.
And so they pressure you to to give, to keep going. And so I think as you move into this journey, it's really important to have a community that
Mhm.
you can be part of, who's supporting. You can have a down day and go, oh, come on, let's get back up or whatever. But also, it motivates you, and having that little bit of accountability is really important. So learning how to cook, and I know you guys are doing an amazing job. You're giving recipes to people, because a lot of people have forgotten how to cook basic foods. The recipes they learn are cakes.
Yes, in schools, that's what they're
Yeah.
learning, and we're probably still de-skilling the next generation. But I mean, you've put over a number of different take homes for families there. So get back into cooking from scratch. Encourage the children to learn even basic recipes. Even starting with eggs, I think is really really good. And you were
Yes.
saying earlier, reconnect with your farmers markets if you can, and not everyone can or has access or has the
Yeah.
time. But then I suppose the veggie box deliveries I mentioned, meat box deliveries, and you were saying shop on the outside of the supermarket. So
Yeah.
why is that? Why is that important?
Because
That
you
is
tend to
actually
find the fresh, seasonal, local on the outside,
Mm,
and most of the processed food on the inside. And beware the health food aisle. That's probably the worst aisle you can go down.
that's a good
Um,
point. Yeah.
yeah, it's claimed to be a health food aisle. Yeah. Where did health foods come from? Who named health foods? The food industry. So it's really hard to unravel some of that information, I think, and hard to believe that it could be true. Surely not. And I don't believe a lot of these things were invented to harm us either. I don't believe people set out to develop trans fats. It was a matter of convenience. Procter and Gamble, they were renowned for making candles and soaps. back in the 1800s. And the invention of electricity meant candle sales weren't so great anymore. So they were trying to work out how to divest their um, inventions and still create a profit. They looked at bars of soap, and someone in Germany had come up with a hydrogenation of this soap, and so they could individually wrap bars and sell them, make it look pretty, and like it was people wanted them. They were deodorized and bleached, and then they started to look at these bars of soap and went, you know what? Looks like lard. And most people cooked with rendered pork fat, which is known as lard back in the 1800s. It was a very stable fat to cook with at high temperatures. And so when they invented this soap bar that looked like lard, they decided in 1911 to market it as a cooking oil, as a hydrogenated cooking oil instead. But I don't believe they ever thought, we're going to give heart attacks to everybody by having this trans fat. Wouldn't have been on their mind at all. So not all inventions and not all people are bad in this space. But it's understanding that these are products that are made from waste products. You know, hydrogenated Crisco originally was made from the waste product of cottonseed oil. The waste products now, we're sending a beautiful prime grade meat to China, and they're sending us their waste product of pea protein. And we're making fake meats out of pea protein, thinking we're doing the right thing. Well, it's a waste product. And is it really healthy? And have we had enough time to look at where this could impact our health? Because they certainly didn't understand the detriment of Crisco and this
Mhm.
hydrogenated fat. And I'd say 80 years, it was starting to be talked about in 1957, but Fred Kummerow, who was calling it out, was completely pushed down all of his messaging, and he didn't have social media back then, so he couldn't be loud like we can about some things. This is very concerning. The World Health Organization have now stated that all trans fats need to be out of food by 2023. The Australian government have not done it. And the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners called for it in 2020, but nothing's been done. They say, oh, we don't have a lot here in Australia. This is what our government said. It's going to disrupt too many food products, remarketing, formulating. We don't need to do it here. But there's so many countries around the world, and now the World Health Organization has called for it. So many countries have already done it. America has completely banned artificial trans fats, and Australia has done nothing. So, on a label, if you have less than 0.5 of a gram of trans fat, you don't even have
Mm.
to acknowledge it on your
Yes.
labels.
Yes. So I mean, for the average family, how best for them to not having the time to read everything and get their heads around all of it.
No,
It's back to your tips, isn't it? It's
it is.
to avoid this harm and to do the best you can to optimize your family's health. It's pretty basic, simple stuff, isn't it? They don't, if they want to learn more. You mentioned your website earlier. I support Gary. And
Yes.
I'll put a link underneath,
Yeah.
and that I think there's so much information and so many written pieces on there if they want to delve
Mm.
deeper, and podcasts that you're on where you call out specific foods and you do explain the interesting history and why they're harmful. But for everyday families who just want to make those
Make
steps
the
that will
changes. Yeah, I think fresh, seasonal and local as much as possible. Minimally processed foods. There's definitely times in the middle of winter when, a tin of tomatoes is a fantastic option to add to a meal. So we're not saying no processed food, certainly not saying no carbohydrate, though we would be a low carb, very low carbohydrate, and Gary particularly. But, a couple little pieces of roast pumpkin are always yummy with a little bit of cinnamon on them, and a little bit of cumin. Just, I think, as you say, it's about enjoying your food still and understanding that a low carbohydrate diet can really improve health outcomes. It can improve your longevity, all sorts of things, and how exciting to still be able to enjoy food and know that you know you're in a good place. You're doing the best you can. Fresh, seasonal, local, minimally processed, and trying to get the foods that are in season is also really, really important. And again, going back to that podcast I mentioned really early on, we've sort of forgotten that there are 4 seasons, and you might not have them quite as extremely in Western Australia as we do in Tasmania, where we really do have 4 seasons. But the Western world's tried to almost make us be a constant summer. We heat and cool our houses so that it's the same temperature. We access the same foods all year round, the food miles and all of those other things. The best time to consume a higher fructose diet when you have fresh seasonal fruits, potentially, is when the sun is shining and you have more vitamin D. So if you have a pear tree or an apple tree or something like that, and in summer you've got your fresh fruit, it does not last like the fruit that you would buy in a supermarket. Like when you pick it, you've only got a few days before it starts to disintegrate and rot. This is it's trying to eat a little bit more seasonally, fresh, and certainly including animal proteins and fats. Don't fear them in your diet because we've evolved to eat those things. And if you look at the health of ancestral diets, there was a guy called Weston A. Price who traveled the world in the 1930s. And the people that he came across that were the healthiest were people eating animal proteins and fats and minimally processed industrial foods. And he said it was everywhere. It was such a stark contrast between those who were in cities and eating processed foods. So I think it just makes sense, but you don't see it when you're stuck in that industrial processed
Yes.
city.
When it's your norm, when it's your everyday norm and
Yes.
it's how you've been brought up, and it's the school food that you're being served in the canteen, and it's when you go out for a meal and it's in your hospitals, it can be completely overwhelming, and that can be your normal food landscape. But I feel quite hopeful.
I do
That
too.
that's good. I was going to ask, do you feel hopeful that
Yes.
family health and nutrition and food is available will be improving for people, and people will be switched on to this area of interest? And
Absolutely. I can see differences all the time. And even in the foods, like you go into the supermarket now and they've got celeriac, which is a low carb vegetable, which if you mash up, it's a lot like a potato. So if you're looking for that sort of texture, it's a really
so
low
tasty.
carb vegetable.
So
That was
tasty.
never around 5 years ago,
Mm. No,
not in Tasmania.
that's true. I don't remember ever seeing one. And yes, and you can get them. They're sometimes really expensive, but actually not too bad to grow as well.
We've got them growing.
I'm coming over.
Yeah, so I think you can. It is the fact that the supermarkets are stocking things like that. The fact that the supermarkets now, I believe, compared to 10 years ago, the berries, there's so many berries there, and the light milks reduced right down, the juices have reduced right down. They respond to consumer buying power as well. So we have that ability to choose what we're doing. And yeah, I think I'm very excited moving forward because I think platforms like yours, Claire, and having these discussions will empower people, will inspire people to make these choices. And they know there's a network of people out there who will support them.
I agree, and I think your work and you are a big part of that, and part of the change that I'm really hopeful for. So yeah, thank you
You're
for your
welcome.
work, and thank you for talking to me. Just finally, do you have any other? You've mentioned a few different resources throughout our chat, Weston A. Price and the podcast earlier. What is there any other particular books or talks that you would suggest for families who are interested in learning more?
David Gillespie's Sweet Poison is a great one just to open up your mind. Of course, Low Carb Down Under have got an incredible lot of resource in videos that people can watch and listen to. And we I don't think you can access the Nutrition for Life anymore, which is such a shame. We had so many really basic and useful resources on that website that I've tried to collate a little bit, and I might try and put onto the iSport Gary in a different area because we had a lot of starter things and all sorts of bits and pieces, which I think are important for people. Well, public health collaboration in the UK have got some great resources on there. Diet Doctor, they've got some great starter sheets and really good ones to take to your doctor if your doctor's a little bit concerned that cholesterol's high or whatever else. Ditch the carbs. She's got a lot
Recipes.
of good recipes as well. But you guys are setting up this amazing resource too. So they probably can't go far past what you're doing.
Oh,
And thank you
thank you.
so much for what you're doing. And I love that you're just taking it and making it simple and bringing it to people, because that's what it's all about. If we make it complicated, if people spend too much time trying to recreate the food that they had before, it makes it expensive and it makes it hard.
Yeah.
Go back and enjoy the simple, unprocessed foods, and it's amazing.
Yes, I totally agree. Make it really, really straightforward and simple. But thank you. That so much, so many take home points, and I just love chatting with you. I really appreciate you. So
Same.
thank you very much, Belinda.
Thank you very much.